Imagine someone offers you $10, no strings attached, simply for agreeing to a proposal made by a stranger about how to split $20 between the two of you. The stranger proposes to keep $18 and give you $2. If you accept, you both get to keep your respective shares. If you reject the offer, neither of you gets anything at all. From the perspective of pure economic self-interest, the correct answer is obvious. $2 is more money than $0, and you should accept any positive offer regardless of how small, because rejecting it leaves you objectively worse off than accepting it would have. And yet, when researchers actually run this experiment, a substantial proportion of people reject offers they perceive as unfair, walking away with nothing, rather than accepting what they experience as an insultingly small share, even though this decision makes them measurably poorer than the alternative. This is not a rare or aberrant response. It is one of the most robustly replicated findings in the entire history of experimental economics, observed across dozens of countries, hundreds of studies, and thousands of participants, and it represents one of the clearest and most consequential pieces of evidence that human beings are not, in fact, the purely self-interested rational actors that classical economic theory has traditionally assumed us to be. This experiment, known as the ultimatum game, and the substantial body of research that has grown up around it, illuminates something fundamental about the human sense of fairness. It is not simply a learned social convention that people apply when convenient and discard when it conflicts with self-interest. It is a deep, often involuntary psychological commitment, one powerful enough to override straightforward material self-interest, and understanding where it comes from and how it operates reveals one of the most consequential and most counterintuitive features of human social psychology. Let's begin with the foundational research that first documented this phenomenon. The economist Werner Guth, who first developed the ultimatum game in a 1982 paper, along with the substantial body of subsequent research it generated, established several findings that have proven remarkably consistent across culturally and economically diverse populations. First, proposers in the game do not typically offer the smallest possible amount, as pure self-interest would predict, but instead tend to offer something closer to a fair, even split, suggesting that proposers themselves anticipate and factor in the responder's fairness expectations even before any rejection has occurred. Second, and more strikingly, responders reliably reject offers below approximately 20 to 25% of the total amount at stake, a rejection rate that holds even when the absolute amount of money involved is substantial, indicating that this is not simply an artifact of trivially small stakes that participants don't take seriously. The economist Colin Kammer at the California Institute of Technology, whose extensive cross-cultural research using the ultimatum game across dramatically different societies has become foundational to this field, found that while the specific threshold at which offers are typically rejected varies somewhat across cultures, ranging from societies with relatively low fairness expectations to societies with notably high ones, the fundamental pattern, a willingness to sacrifice material self-interest in order to punish a perceived violation of fairness norms, appears in some form across virtually every human population studied, including hunter-gatherer, pastoralist, and small-scale horticultural societies with minimal exposure to market economies, suggesting that this is not simply a byproduct of exposure to modern capitalist economic systems, but reflects something considerably more fundamental about human psychology. The specific psychological mechanism underlying rejection of unfair offers has been examined in detail through neuroimaging research, conducted by the neuroscientist Alan Sanfei and colleagues, whose landmark brain imaging study found that unfair offers in the ultimatum game reliably activate the anterior insula, a brain region strongly associated with the processing of negative emotional states, including disgust, and that the degree of anterior insula activation in response to a specific unfair offer directly predicted whether that specific offer would ultimately be rejected. This finding is significant because it demonstrates that the rejection of unfair offers is not simply a calculated strategic decision, but is substantially driven by a genuine, visceral emotional response, one that engages neural circuitry associated with disgust and aversion, rather than circuitry more typically associated with careful deliberative reasoning. Sanfei's research also documented competing activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a brain region associated with cognitive control and the deliberate override of automatic emotional impulses, and found that the relative balance of activation between the emotionally driven anterior insula and the more deliberative dorsolateral prefrontal cortex predicted whether a given participant would accept or reject a specific unfair offer, providing a specific neural account of the internal conflict between immediate emotional reaction to perceived unfairness and more calculated economic self-interest that characterizes the decision-making process in this situation. The evolutionary account of why this powerful and often materially costly fairness psychology would have evolved has been developed extensively by the anthropologist Joseph Henrich at Harvard University, whose large-scale cross-cultural research program testing the ultimatum game and related economic games across 15 distinct small-scale societies found that the specific degree of fairness sensitivity observed in a given society correlates closely with that society's degree of market integration and cooperative interdependence, meaning the extent to which members of that society routinely engage in economic exchange and cooperative activity with individuals outside their immediate family unit. Henrich's research found that societies characterized by greater reliance on cooperative activities requiring coordination among unrelated or distantly related individuals, including cooperative hunting of large game requiring multiple participants and market-based trade with strangers, showed correspondingly higher fairness expectations and higher rejection rates for unfair offers, while societies with more self-sufficient household-based economies, involving less routine cooperative interdependence with unrelated individuals, showed correspondingly lower fairness expectations and higher tolerance for unequal offers. This finding suggests that human fairness psychology, rather than being a fixed and universal constant, evolved and continues to be calibrated specifically in response to the actual structure of cooperative interdependence that characterizes a given society, becoming more stringent in societies where successful cooperation with genetic strangers is more central to individual and collective survival. This connects to a broader evolutionary theoretical framework developed by the economist Herbert Gintis and the anthropologist Samuel Bowles, who have proposed that human fairness psychology, including the willingness to reject unfair offers even at direct personal material cost, functions as what they call a costly signal of trustworthiness and cooperative intent, one that solves a fundamental problem inherent to any system of cooperation among unrelated individuals, the problem of how to reliably identify which potential cooperative partners can actually be trusted not to exploit the cooperative relationship for unilateral personal gain. Gintis and Bowles' account proposes that an individual who is known, through reputation or direct observation, to be willing to reject unfair offers even at direct personal cost sends a credible and difficult-to-fake signal that they will not tolerate being exploited in future cooperative interactions. A signal that, once established, actually reduces the likelihood that potential cooperative partners will attempt to exploit them in the first place, because those partners correctly anticipate that any attempt to secure an unfairly large share of the benefits from a cooperative venture will be met with costly resistance. On this account, the apparently irrational willingness to reject a positive but unfair offer is not actually irrational at all when evaluated across the full span of an individual's expected lifetime of repeated social and economic interaction, even though it does appear straightforwardly irrational when evaluated in the narrow context of any single, isolated economic transaction of the kind the laboratory ultimatum game artificially creates. The psychologist Ernst Fehr, whose research on altruistic punishment we examined in an earlier video in this series on the psychology of why humans form cues, has extended this evolutionary account through extensive experimental research, documenting that human fairness psychology extends well beyond simple two-person interactions like the ultimatum game into more complex multi-person cooperative contexts, finding that human participants across a wide range of experimental economic games show a robust and cross-culturally consistent willingness to personally sacrifice resources specifically in order to punish individuals who violate cooperative norms, even when the punishing individual has no personal stake in the specific transaction being punished and derives no direct material benefit whatsoever from imposing the punishment. Fehr's research on what he and his collaborators call strong reciprocity has documented that this willingness to engage in costly punishment of unfairness, even toward complete strangers in anonymous, one-shot interactions with no possibility of future reciprocity or reputational consequence, cannot be fully explained by the reputational signaling account that Gintis and Bowles propose for the two-person ultimatum game specifically, because reputational signaling requires that the punishing behavior actually be observed by potential future cooperative partners, a condition that does not hold in the specific anonymous experimental conditions under which Fehr's strongest findings on costly third-party punishment have been documented. This has led Fair and other researchers to propose that human fairness psychology may involve not simply a calculated, even if evolutionarily ancient signaling strategy, but a genuinely internalized moral emotion, one that motivates punishment of unfairness as an end in itself, rather than purely as an instrumental means toward securing future reputational or cooperative benefit. An emotional commitment to fairness, so deeply internalized through the long evolutionary history of human cooperative social life, that it continues to operate even in modern, anonymous laboratory contexts that bear little resemblance to the small, reputation-tracking ancestral social groups in which this psychology most plausibly originally evolved. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses an important variant of the basic ultimatum game that reveals something additional about the specific psychological structure underlying human fairness judgments. The distinction between what researchers call procedural fairness and distributive fairness, and how each independently shapes the human response to unequal outcomes. The economist Martin Duffenberg, working with Georg Kirchsteiger, developed an influential theoretical framework proposing that human fairness judgments depend not simply on the final distribution of resources, but substantially on the perceived intentions behind that distribution, a framework they call psychological game theory. This account predicts, and subsequent experimental research has confirmed, that an identical unequal outcome produces dramatically different psychological and behavioral responses depending on whether that outcome resulted from a deliberate choice by another person or from a random, impersonal process beyond anyone's control. The economist Elizabeth Hoffman and her collaborators demonstrated this intention sensitivity directly through a variant of the ultimatum game, in which the role of proposer, the person who decides how to split the money, was assigned either through a process explicitly described as random chance, or through a process in which participants competed for the proposer role based on performance on a general knowledge quiz. Hoffman's research found that responders showed substantially higher tolerance for unequal splits when the proposer had earned their advantage position through the quiz competition, compared to when the same advantage position and the same unequal split resulted from simple random assignment, demonstrating that human fairness judgments are sensitive not simply to outcomes, but to the perceived legitimacy of the process that produced those outcomes. This finding has been extended considerably by the economist Armin Falk, whose research using what is known as the mini-ultimatum game, a simplified variant in which the proposer chooses between only two possible offers rather than being able to select any arbitrary split, found that responder rejection rates depend heavily not simply on the specific offer received, but on what alternative offer the proposer could have made instead, but chose not to. Falk's research found that an identical unequal offer, for instance an 8-2 split in the proposer's favor, produced dramatically different rejection rates depending on whether the only alternative available to the proposer was an even more unequal split. In which case the 8-2 offer was widely accepted as the best available option under the circumstances, or whether the alternative available was a perfectly equal split that the proposer deliberately chose not to offer, in which case the identical 8-2 offer was rejected at dramatically higher rates. This finding, sometimes called the kindness of intentions effect, demonstrates that human fairness psychology performs a considerably more sophisticated computation than simply evaluating whether a given division of resources meets some fixed threshold of acceptability. It performs an implicit counterfactual analysis, comparing the offer actually received against the range of offers the proposer could plausibly have made instead, and calibrates the emotional and behavioral response specifically to what this comparison reveals about the proposer's underlying intentions and character, rather than to the objective magnitude of the resulting inequality alone. An unfair outcome that resulted from constrained circumstances is judged and responded to completely differently from an identical unfair outcome that reflects a freely chosen decision to treat another person unfairly when a fairer option was readily available. The developmental question of when this fairness sensitivity first emerges in human cognitive development has been examined extensively by the developmental psychologist Ernst Fair, working with Catherine McAuliffe, whose research documented that children as young as 4 years of age already show a measurable willingness to reject unequal resource distributions, including distributions that would objectively benefit them, showing what researchers call disadvantageous inequity aversion, a preference for equal outcomes even when unequal outcomes would provide the child with objectively more resources than an equal split would. McAuliffe's research found a developmentally significant pattern, While young children show clear aversion to receiving less than a fair share from an early age, the more sophisticated aversion to receiving more than a fair share, a preference researchers call advantageous inequity aversion, in which children voluntarily forego a personally beneficial unequal distribution in favor of a fair one, even when they themselves are the beneficiary of the unfair distribution, does not reliably emerge until somewhat later in childhood development, typically around 7 or 8 years of age, suggesting that the capacity to recognize and act on unfairness that personally benefits oneself requires additional social cognitive development beyond the more basic capacity to recognize and resent unfairness that personally disadvantages oneself. There is one final dimension of this research worth examining, because it extends the study of fairness psychology beyond humans entirely, addressing the question of whether this apparently sophisticated moral psychology has any precedent in the behavior of other species, a comparison that helps clarify exactly what is evolutionarily distinctive about the human case. The primatologist Sarah Brosnan, working with Franz de Waal at Emory University, conducted a series of influential experiments documenting that capuchin monkeys show a measurable behavioral response to unequal treatment, strikingly reminiscent of human fairness psychology. In Brosnan and de Waal's classic paradigm, two capuchin monkeys positioned side by side were each trained to perform an identical simple task, exchanging a small token for a food reward, and researchers then varied whether both monkeys received the same reward, typically a piece of cucumber, or whether one monkey received the identical cucumber reward while the other received a more highly preferred reward, typically a grape, for performing the exact same task. Brosnan and de Waal found that capuchin monkeys who observed a neighboring monkey receive the superior grape reward for performing an identical task frequently refuse to continue participating in the exchange task themselves, and in some cases refuse to accept or eat the cucumber reward they had previously accepted without complaint, a response the researchers interpreted as evidence of a rudimentary aversion to unequal treatment with clear evolutionary continuity to human disadvantageous inequity aversion. This finding, replicated subsequently in several other primate species, including chimpanzees, has been influential in establishing that at least some basic components of fairness sensitivity, specifically the aversion to receiving less than a comparison individual for equivalent effort, may have evolutionary roots considerably older than the emergence of the human lineage specifically. However, the primatologist Sarah Brosnan's subsequent comparative research, along with work by other researchers in the field, has documented an important limitation to this cross-species parallel that helps clarify what is genuinely distinctive about human fairness psychology specifically. While capuchin monkeys and other primates show clear evidence of disadvantageous inequity aversion, resenting getting less than a comparison individual, there is little to no evidence in any non-human primate species studied of advantageous inequity aversion, the willingness to reject a personally favorable unequal outcome, specifically because it disadvantages another individual, the more sophisticated form of fairness sensitivity that emerges only later in human childhood development, and that plays the central role in the ultimatum game rejections of unfair offers that this video has focused on throughout. This comparative limitation is theoretically significant because it suggests that the basic capacity to notice and resent being personally disadvantaged relative to others may indeed have deep evolutionary roots shared with other primate species, but the more sophisticated and more evolutionarily consequential capacity to actively enforce fairness norms even at direct personal cost, including situations where the individual enforcing the norm is not personally disadvantaged by the specific unfairness in question, appears to be a considerably more evolutionarily recent development, one plausibly connected to the specific and unusual degree of large-scale cooperation among genetically unrelated individuals that characterizes human social organization in a way that has no close parallel among our primate relatives. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of human fairness psychology as a sophisticated evolutionary adaptation, one specifically calibrated to the demands of large-scale cooperation among genetically unrelated individuals that characterizes human social life to a degree unmatched by virtually any other species. An adaptation that operates through genuine emotional commitment rather than purely calculated strategic reasoning, that develops through a specific and identifiable trajectory across childhood, and that produces behavior which appears irrational when evaluated against the narrow standard of immediate material self-interest, but that reflects a deeper and evolutionarily coherent logic when evaluated against the full span of the repeated, reputation-tracking cooperative relationships that characterize the small-scale societies in which human beings evolved. The person who rejects an unfair ultimatum game offer, walking away with nothing rather than accepting an insultingly small share, is not behaving irrationally in any deep sense. They are executing, in a modern laboratory setting that their evolved psychology was never designed to anticipate, exactly the same fairness-enforcing behavioral program that made large-scale human cooperation possible in the first place. A program calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years to a world of small, interdependent groups in which the willingness to walk away from an unfair deal, however costly in the moment, was the very thing that made you someone worth dealing fairly with in the future. The $2 left on the table is not a loss. It is the price of remaining, in the eyes of your evolved psychology, someone who cannot be safely exploited. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.